Every year on March 4th, or the closest weekend to it, the Pioneer Dinner is held in Milton House to celebrate the founding of the town of Milton. On March 4th, 1839, a party of 13 people led by Joseph and Nancy Goodrich arrived at a locked, red-frame building Joseph had built in Milton, though it would not be called Milton until a few years later. It had been a hard months-long journey from New York State, and they were all cold and tired and hungry. The thermometer read 0 outside, and the only thing ready to eat when they arrived was a pot of cold beans and some Johnny cakes that their house sitter had left in the oven. It wasn't much, but it was their new home, and they intended to make the best of it. That spirit is what the Pioneer Dinner is meant to celebrate. What a lot of people do not know is that something that happened 3 days later has been celebrated for far longer, and with more frequency. On the morning of March 7th, 1839, the group of pioneers settled into their house. Nancy Goodrich, her arm still in a sling from a broken collarbone she had suffered the first day of the wagon trip, cooked breakfast while the men went out over dozens of things they needed to do in order to get their farm ready for the spring. They had arrived in Milton far later than they had planned, and there was so much to be done. But something remained unsaid by all of them as they ate their breakfast. It was the Sabbath, and all the work they had to get done would need to wait till the next day if they were to honor the conviction in their hearts that the Sabbath was to be kept as a day of rest and devotion. Finally, Nancy Goodrich could bear it no longer and said, "This is the Sabbath, and how shall we spend it?" And after a moment of silence at this astounding announcement, someone said, "It is an important question." Their closest neighbors were the 10 members of the Crandall family. They had been living in the Milton area for the past 6 months with no fellow Sabbath keepers to fellowship with. Joseph resolved to travel to his friend's house and invite the Crandalls over to decide how they were to spend the Sabbath that day and for the foreseeable future. A total of 22 people gathered in the Goodrich home and established the first moral society in Milton. Believing that mere resolutions were quickly forgotten, they instead signed a written document where they all agreed to watch out for each other for good, to maintain good morals, and attend meetings on the Sabbath when prudent. In the years since, more than 9,000 Sabbaths have been kept by the Seventh Day Baptists in Milton. On November 12, 1840, 175 years and 2 days ago today, our church was officially formed and the first of our 18 head pastors was called. Our first pastor, Stillman Kuhn, was known for his work in building and establishing Seventh-day Baptist Church throughout Wisconsin and even into Illinois. It was this work that he employed in his 5 years in Milton, though he later resided in the town after stepping down as pastor. He was evidently so popular that some members still voted for him to come back after our fourth pastor resigned in 1859. Under our next 4 pastors, Vernon Hull, William Whitford, Oliver Hull, and Darwin Maxson, the issue of slavery became a top concern in the Seventh-day Baptist denomination. The Seventh-day Baptist General Conference went so far as to declare the institution as a sin against God in 1854. Many Seventh-day Baptists, including 48 men from the Milton Church alone, joined the Union Army during the Civil War. This period of change for the country was a period of change for the church as well. Milton became an academic community with the growth and development of Milton College, which had been founded as Milton Academy by Joseph Goodrich and many of his fellow Seventh-day Baptists. The church and Milton College would have a close relationship through the college's entire history. The arrival of the railroad in 1850 gave birth to Milton's sister community, Milton Junction. Founded as a railroad community, there were many personal and cultural differences between the Seventh-day Baptists who inhabited this new town and the old town of Milton, but they continued to attend the same church for the next 26 years. But by 1876, a split in the church had been a long time coming. Many members in Milton Junction felt the need to have their own church separate from Milton Church. The divisions between church members had become so deep that Lester Rogers, the current Milton pastor, left to become the first pastor in the Milton Junction Church. This experience, though painful for everyone involved at the time, allowed both Milton and Milton Junction churches to grow and minister to their members in their own fashion, providing more opportunities for lay leadership in both communities. After such a split, a steady hand was needed to keep the church stable and growing. The church found that in new pastor Elston Dunn. His 20-year pastorship is the third longest in Milton's history. A former tax collector who had lost the use of one eye, his leadership and easy humor were exactly what the church needed. While the Wright brothers made their first flight, local ministry under our ninth pastor, Louis Platts, soared, adding over 150 new members in 13 years. A concern for things outside of Milton grew as well, with the women's board under Lewis's wife, Emma, financing many mission trips. Platt's death in 1909 brought his service to the Milton Church to an early end. Later that year, Lester Randolph became the first graduate of Milton College to serve as pastor in the Milton Church. Shortly after the end of World War I, his service as pastor was cut short by the Spanish influenza, which claimed one of his sons, then the pastor himself in short order. He became the second head pastor in a row to die during his service to the Milton Church. After the sudden loss of Lester Randolph, a former pastoral assistant at the Milton Junction Church, Henry Jordan, stepped in to fill the sudden void. After 5 years, however, he felt called back to his previous position as a minister to the mentally ill, and the church was ready for long-term leadership again. James Skaggs' leadership during the trying time of the Great Depression was noted by his neighbors and by his church. Many in Milton were left out of work and in dire financial straits by the harshest economic disaster in our country's history. Said a neighbor of his during his time in Milton, he was not a follower of the crowd, but stood out as a leader and a landmark in the several communities that were privileged to come under his spiritual leadership. With the Depression in full swing, the church was hit by hardship on another front. On Sabbath morning, November 26, 1932, the church burned down. Soot hidden by plaster was ignited, escaped through a crack, and caught the church on fire. Nearly everything was destroyed, including many church and society records. It was this tragedy that took up much of Carroll Hill's first few years as head pastor. After worshiping in temporary facilities for nearly a year, a new church, which stands today, was completed in 1934. Still in the height of the Great Depression, many of the men out of work came to help in the construction of their new house of worship. As World War II drew to a close and the Cold War raged, our next pastor focused his attention on youth ministry. The crowning achievement of Elmo Fitzrandolph's 22-year pastorship, the second longest in church history, is the establishment of Camp Wakanda. A forward-thinking man with a passion for youth ministry, Elmo went so far as to purchase a wooded lot across from the camp, a move that many thought careless at the time. Some went so far as to call it Randy's Folly. But over the years, the sale of timber has netted 10 times the original purchase price, as well as providing a wooded area in an otherwise suburban sprawl. Our next two pastors, Earl Cruzan and Herbert Saunders, became well regarded for their denominational leadership and helped deal with the enhanced role the Milton Church would need to serve as the Seventh Day Baptist denomination moved its administration offices to the Janesville area. During Saunders' tenure, a new addition to the church building called the Burdick Wing was built and dedicated to administrative and Sabbath school uses. The longest tenured pastor at the Milton Church at 25 years, George Calhoun led the church from the triumphant days of the Soviet Union's collapse to the tragic days of 9/11 and beyond into the world of smartphones. In the 1990s, the church expanded its youth ministry by joining the Awana clubs, with many new families joining the church. George left the Milton Church in a position for success in 2015, as it didn't have to look far to find its next head pastor. An assistant pastor in Milton for 8 years, Nathan Crandall was called to be our 18th head pastor on August 29th of this year, leaving the future of the church leadership in good hands with both our new head pastor and current assistant pastor, Liz Green. Every one of us watching this, in one way or another, have been blessed with a passion for Christ and dedicated adherence to the Word of God of every one of our pastors, as well as the countless deacons, lay leaders, and everyday churchgoers over our 175 years. We thank God for each and every one of them and pray that He will continue to send more of them to us and to our children.